This presentation covers the prohibition on subsidies to IUU fishing, that's illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. And essentially the idea here is that members would commit not to provide subsidies to fishing vessels and potentially the operators running them if the vessel had been found to be engaged in illegal, unreported or unregulated fishing. So in this part of the WTO negotiations, most discussion is focusing on an approach that would require subsidies provided to fishing vessels to be prohibited, to be withdrawn, where a final determination of IUU fishing is made. So what this means broadly is that a member's subsidy obligation is triggered by a final determination, a final administrative decision after a review and appeal, taken by itself or taken by another member, a determination that a vessel or an operator was engaged in activity that counts as illegal, unreported or unregulated under the relevant laws. So this trigger of an obligation is not likely to be automatic. So it's likely to be subject to some requirements, which is what we'll discuss next. An important point to note here is that members generally agree, I think, that issuing a determination of IUU fishing is a right that they have. It's not an obligation. In other words, this agreement in the WTO does not oblige members to make determinations of IUU fishing. They may make them or not according to their own fisheries legislation. But what this agreement does is it would oblige members to remove subsidies from vessels or operators that are the subject of that determination under particular conditions. There are some texts on the table that also include a further approach to the rule that could potentially work perhaps as an addition to the determination-based obligation. And that would be a broad obligation to ensure, members would be under a broad obligation to ensure they have measures in place to be sure that subsidies don't go to IUU fishing. So that idea could work as a complement to the idea of a determination triggering a subsidy obligation. So what are the key decisions? There are many. There are 4. So the first one is the decision of whose determinations would trigger the obligation to remove subsidies. Now, members have proposed several different options based on different jurisdictions under maritime law that have responsibility for fishing activity and which could make determinations of IUU fishing. And there's probably most convergence over the first 2 of those options listed on the slide, determinations of fishing by coastal states and determinations by RFMOs. So just to walk through them briefly and explain them, coastal states have the right to regulate fishing activity within their exclusive economic zones. So that means, for instance, setting catch limits or imposing different zones for different kinds of fishing. And coastal states have primary responsibility for enforcing those laws. So they're well placed to issue a determination of whether a vessel or an operator has broken one of those laws. RFMOs, regional fisheries management organizations or arrangements, are essentially international agreements, in the case of RFMOs, international agreements between countries on rules to fishing in certain areas. And many RFMOs already have lists of vessels which the parties to that RFMO have agreed have been engaged in IUU fishing. So there's already an example of the kinds of determinations that RFMOs can make of IUU fishing. Moving down the list, flag states have responsibility under the law of the sea for the activities of vessels that fly their flag. So they could potentially issue determinations of that fishing has taken place in contravention of applicable laws. The 4th idea is that a subsidizing member itself should be obliged to remove subsidies from vessels when it itself has made a determination of IUU fishing. And the main impact of this option is probably to require a degree of coherence between a subsidising member's domestic fisheries decisions and its subsidy policies. A further idea is that determinations of IUU fishing made by port states could also trigger the subsidy prohibition. And this in particular is because port states can make findings of IUU fishing under the Port State Measures Agreement for the purpose of closing their ports to vessels they believe have been engaged in IUU fishing. Now, there are arguments sort of for and against many of these options, but those are the general ideas that are on the table in respect of this key decision, whose determinations should trigger a subsidy obligation. The second key decision in the design of this prohibition is what due process steps should be required before determinations can trigger a subsidy obligation. And the policy challenge here is that members would like some kind of safeguard that ensures that determinations that might be made unfairly by another member don't automatically trigger their obligation to remove subsidies from a vessel or operator. At the same time, the conditions imposed can't be so strict that subsidizing members can always escape the obligation to remove subsidies. So this is the balance that the discussion of conditions is trying to strike. There are several ideas on the table, including the requirement that determinations should be based on positive evidence, that they should be established using fair, transparent, and non-discriminatory procedures, and also that the process should include at least notification of the vessel's flag state, notification to the flag state that the vessel may have been engaged in IUU activity, and potentially an opportunity for the flag state or the subsidizing state to provide information to the country making the determination about that vessel's activity. And it's worth, I think, highlighting here that the objective here is that the due process requirements would apply to the process of how a determination is made, but they would not affect the validity or the enforceability of a determination. So that means any authority would be free to decide, for example, what activity to focus on in its maritime control and surveillance efforts. It would be free to decide what activity justified investigation and sanctions. But the administrative process of arriving at the determination would need to meet certain due process requirements if it was to act as a trigger for another member's subsidy obligation. Turning now to the third and fourth key decisions in the IUU prohibition pillar. Decision number 3 is whether, and if so, how the agreement should clarify how the prohibition, this prohibition, should be implemented. And of the two ideas on the table, the first one is probably the most important, because this would involve limiting the scope of the determinations that would trigger a subsidy prohibition. And this is the idea that's referred to and it's called proportionality, often in the negotiating context. So some members have proposed to limit the application of this rule by allowing the subsidizing member to decide that a determination related to a minor violation of the rules did not justify the removal of subsidies. Now, the subsidizing member might still be required to remove the subsidies if the determination related to a serious offence, and there's a suggestion that the agreement would list what a serious offence was. But overall, the idea of proportionality would serve to limit a subsidizing member's obligation to remove subsidies if a determination was made. And as with most proposals for deference and flexibility, this idea, if adopted or as adopted, would have an impact on the effectiveness of the rules. The more flexibility you provide to the subsidizing member to decide when it should remove subsidies, the more scope you leave for it potentially to decide not to. The second idea, the idea of duration, suggests that there should be in the agreement potentially a minimum amount of time during which the subsidy would be prohibited. So both of these ideas relate to defining in the agreement or clarifying in the agreement how a government should implement this prohibition. The fourth key decision is what, if any, special and differential treatment might be provided for developing country members under this rule. And again, there are several ideas on the table, most of which focus on providing flexibility in the application of the rules on subsidies to unreported and unregulated fishing. So that's the U and the U and the IUU. And broadly, we think members seem to agree that the discipline should apply equally to all fishing that's found to be actually illegal. The question is, should there be flexibility for fishing or for subsidies to fishing that's found to be unreported or unregulated? One idea on the table is to provide longer timeframes to allow developing country members to implement systems to address unreported and unregulated fishing before an obligation to remove subsidies from determinations of that fishing would apply. Another idea is that subsidies would not need to be removed in the case of determinations related to small-scale, unreported or unregulated fishing that takes place in a member's territorial sea, which again is the area very close to shore, only 12 nautical miles or so from land. So again, four quite large decisions that still remain to be made on the question of IUU or subsidies to IUU fishing, how the prohibition or whose determinations should trigger the subsidy obligation, should there be due process requirements that apply to those determinations before they trigger a subsidy obligation, how or whether we should clarify how the prohibition should be implemented, should there be a degree of proportionality, and what special and differential treatment, if any, would be appropriate and effective in this context.